Hey, my name is Daniel and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era video, and today we're focusing on the Archer class, a ranged damage dealer that excels at piercing enemies and staying just out of reach. As always in my class guide videos, I'll be covering everything you need to know about this class, how their abilities work, how and when to upgrade to the master side, which races pair well with them, what starting skill line to choose, what additional skill lines offer good synergy, and what items can enhance the build. And finally, I'll show a bit of gameplay so you could get a sense of how the class actually plays and feels at the table. I'll put timestamps in the description if you want to jump ahead, although I would really appreciate if you stick around for the whole thing. Now, a quick disclaimer: I think figuring things out for yourself is one of the most rewarding parts in this game, and I would encourage everyone to experiment and find their own playstyle. That said, the game can feel a bit overwhelming at first, so this guide is here to help you get started and understand how the class works. And if you're already a seasoned player, I hope you can still find something interesting here too. And now let's get into the guide. Alright, so let's talk about the Archer class, and as always we begin with the innate ability. And it says at the start of your turn, if you are in ranged battle form, deal 2 damage to a targetable enemy. So this is essentially a passive damage that you just deal every turn without even rolling any dice, which is pretty nice. But as always, there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. And I would say the main thing you need to know is the timing of this effect, which says at the start of your turn, which happens before any of your actions, movement or even recovery dice. As a matter of fact, if you have a look at the basic combat dice skill reference sheet, on the back of this sheet there is a turn breakdown. As you can tell, start of turn is happening before recovery or any actions. And what that means essentially that you need to start your turn in ranged battle form, and in order to start battle form in ranged you need to end your turn in ranged battle form as well. So at the moment we have 2 stamina. That means that our range is also 2, and we're currently 3 hexes away from the enemy. So you might be thinking that you might want to move 1 hex first and then trigger this innate ability, but unfortunately that's not gonna work because you need to do this before any actions including movement. So if you would be standing here 3 hexes away while you have 2 stamina, then you won't be able to deal any damage to this Breton Bandit. Also, let's say that you moved, then you rolled some damage, dealing damage to this enemy, the exhaust this die, then maybe you take in another engage, and maybe this time you want to have some defense up, so you might want to roll those basic combat dice in defensive battle form. So you're rolling them, you're placing them in your active slot, and that means that you end in your turn in defensive battle form, and therefore you start your next turn not in ranged battle form, and therefore your innate ability not gonna trigger as well. So of course we're talking about really basic things, but it's just important to keep in mind that you need to be actually in ranged battle form, and you need to be in range, and you need to trigger this effect before any of your movements or any actions for that matter. Now there are a couple of items in the game that can increase your range, specifically a couple of bows like this one, a maple bow for example, and you might be wondering whether this effect can increase the range of your innate ability. And I'm afraid that the answer is no, simply because the effect of all weapons can be applied only during your engage, and your class ability including your innate ability is not considered an engage. But of course the fact that your class abilities including this innate ability is not considered an engage is actually a pretty good thing, because this damage won't trigger certain enemy skills that only apply after being engaged. For example, like this Shatter, a very nasty skill that forces you to overtax a weapon or discard another weapon, but with this innate ability you can chip away its health without triggering this effect. Overall, I would say this innate ability is great. It provides some a little bit more of consistent damage, and even though it's just 2 damage, which obviously would do nothing against enemies with 2 defense or more, but it's still pretty reliable damage against some low level enemies, or maybe against some beasts that usually don't have any defense, or maybe against stalwart enemies. And of course, even though a stalwart enemy can lose only a single health per turn, that's still pretty useful, because that means you don't need to waste your precious dice or engages against those enemies. You can just let your innate ability finish off the job. It's also pretty good to finishing off some divert enemies or some dodge enemies. And so even though this innate ability isn't very effective against some high level enemies, it's still pretty decent overall. And just last quick reminder that remember that it says targetable enemies, and targetable when you are in ranged battle form, it means in range up to your stamina stat, but as a limitation of ranged battle form you cannot target adjacent enemies. So let's say if you would start your turn adjacent to this enemy for example, you cannot deal damage to this with this innate ability because it's not a targetable enemy for this particular battle form. And even if you have a bow that allows you to target adjacent enemies, it's this one, Rescuer Bow. As we already established, all weapon effects work only on engages, and this ability does not consider it an engage, and therefore even though you may target adjacent enemies in ranged battle form when you engage in them, you still cannot do this with this innate ability, so only non-adjacent targets. Moving on to the class abilities, we have accuracy for 1 tenacity in ranged battle form, Interrupt. When selecting a target, increase your range by 1. And while this works plain and simple, let's say we have this Breton bandit in 3 hexes away, and because we have only 2 stamina, it means normally we can target enemies only within range 2, but with accuracy at that very moment we can interrupt and spend 1 tenacity to increase our range by 1, and therefore in this case target enemies up to 3 hexes away. And a cool little thing that unlike weapons that only works when you engage in an enemy, this class ability doesn't say anything about engages, so it's only when you're selecting a target, and therefore it can even work with your passive innate ability. And even though earlier I said that your innate ability is happening before any of your actions, which include class abilities as well, but because this particular ability says interrupt, it can indeed happen even at the start of your turn when you're selecting a target for your innate ability. Moving on, next we have Hawk Eye. For 2 tenacity, heal for health equal to the number of enemies within your range. And I think this ability is great, because Archer is a pretty squishy class. We don't have any way of mitigating damage or preventing damage in any capacity. It means that we will take occasional hits, and this ability certainly helps to recover from that. And again, in this particular example, because we have 2 stamina, it means our range is 2, and because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 enemies within our range, we can spend 2 tenacity to heal for 5 health, which is huge. I think this ability is great early in the game, especially when you're playing on the expert difficulty. You maybe don't want to use your adventurer rest, maybe because you don't have some items, or maybe you want some items but you don't want to discard them, so it's pretty helpful to being able to heal during the combat, especially since the number of health is scalable, so it's super flexible. I think it's great, and it's also very helpful in the late endgame dungeons, especially when there are certain can encounter rules when sometimes you're taking extra true damage, or sometimes maybe there are enemies that are immune to damage until certain conditions are met, so they are still dealing damage to you while you cannot defeat them quickly. So yeah, in the end games there are plenty of situations where sometimes you take extra hits, and this Hawkeye ability definitely helps to recover and kinda increases your sustainability dramatically. Moving on, next we have Lethal Arrow. For 3 tenacity in ranged battle form, roll 2 enemy combat dice against a targetable enemy. Roll damage is true damage. And of course, rolling just 2 enemy combat dice for 3 tenacity might feel a little bit underwhelming, but that last part, that roll damage is true damage, changes it all. And that makes this ability works just absolutely beautifully against some high defensive enemies, for example like this Flame Atronach 3 defense, which is a lot, and you shouldn't really underestimate true damage, because essentially if you roll even just basic 2 damage with those enemy combat dice, and that would be true damage, that is essentially equivalent of dealing just 5 normal non-true damage because of those 3 defense. So that is quite a lot of damage, and of course you can potentially even roll up to 4 damage of true damage, of course, if you're very lucky. It doesn't happen too often obviously, but still there is a chance. And overall I really like it. I think it's great for finishing off some enemies, for some divert enemies, or for some high shielded enemies like this one. And yeah, just dealing more damage, which is not even considered an engage, again is great. Moving on, next we have Hunter's Discipline. For 3 tenacity, interrupt. When a non-quest enemy is deployed, remove it and deploy a random enemy from the same level to the same hex. Heal for 3 health. So basically at the start of a clash or dungeon encounter, or in a delve when you're revealing a new delve tile and you deploying enemies, at that very moment you can spend 3 tenacity to interrupt, and instead of enemy that you deployed, let's say instead of this Dark Elf Bandit, you're gonna deploy another level 1 enemy. And while this ability may seem a little bit underwhelming, trust me, there are a couple of enemies that are absolutely pain to deal with, especially when you're playing in true solo. One of such examples is probably Harpy, a level 20 enemy with elusive and native, because the way elusive works, it means that this enemy won't take any damage from you unless you started your turn adjacent to this enemy. But if you start this enemy adjacent to this enemy, it means you need to end your turn adjacent, and if you do, that means that this enemy will definitely hit you at least once. And I must say that it is quite annoying, especially since this enemy has range 2, which means it's not gonna go adjacent to you, it is you that need to come adjacent, but that also means that next turn, or rather on this unit's turn, it's gonna roll 3 enemy combat dice to you, which may be just the end of your campaign easily. And also because it has native, it also can be pretty bad depending on the region. I would say in Morrowind this might be actually the worst, because that means that you also gain blind if you deal some damage to this enemy. So yeah, overall this Harpy is such a pain to deal with as a ranged character. This may be not a problem if you're playing with other adventurers, but when you're playing solo, personally I'm absolutely happy to just spend 3 tenacity to replace and just completely remove this enemy and deploy another level 20 enemy. Even this Flame Atronach, even though it rolls 4 enemy combat dice instead of 3, I can just safely defeat this enemy first, so it won't be as threatening and not as annoying as those elusive enemies. So overall I would say this Hunter's Discipline is not something I would use every battle, but I'm glad this ability exists, because you can essentially remove the most annoying enemies even before the battle starts. And the final class ability, Venom Arrows, for 5 tenacity in ranged battle form, roll 3 status dice and apply them to targetable enemies. So status dice are these dice that consist of all of those status effects, like Fear and Bane and Maim and others, and you roll all of them 3 together, and you can then choose to apply, let's say, this one to this enemy, this one to that, and this one to this, something like that. It's completely up to you, but the only caveat is that each of those status die has one of the 6 chances to gain stealth status, which is this one, and if those dice landed on this side, you still need to resolve it and apply them to enemies. And you might think that applying stealth to enemies is a little bit ridiculous, and you will be totally right, but that's how this skill works. You can almost treat this as a miss. You know, you tried to roll this die, but hey, it landed on this one, so now you cannot target this enemy. And for this reason, personally, I'm not a big fan of this ability. I think it might be a bit too much of hit or miss, and personally, I would rather spend those tenacity on dealing some damage with a lethal arrow. I think it's still more consistent and reliable, and damage is good. And of course, even though applying 3 status dice to enemies can be extremely powerful, especially if you manage to roll something like Fear or maybe Bane to multiple enemies, especially Star World enemies, that is definitely very powerful, but just because of the random nature of this ability, I'm personally just not a huge fan of it. Now let's see how to promote your class to the master side, and it says that you need to defeat an enemy that is 6 or more hexes away, which is basically the entire clash. If you're standing on the opposite sides, that is exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hexes away. And well, remember all those things that can increase your range, this is where they definitely come in handy. Our first class ability, Accuracy, can increase the range by 1, so this is a little help already. If you manage to get this maple bow, it can also help quite a bit, because with Accuracy and this bow combined, it means you need only 4 stamina in order to be able to target enemies within 6 hexes away, so that is already pretty doable. But of course, if you manage to get this bow of the Deadlands, this is basically like a free upgrade. This is a jackpot for our class, especially while you're on the Novice side, because it can increase your range by 4, so you can potentially defeat an enemy 6 hexes away, even while still having only 2 stamina. So definitely pay attention to these bows, especially early in the game, while you're still Novice Archer, because they will definitely help you to promote to the Master much quicker. Although frankly, none of these bows particularly helpful in the end game, or late game in general, but we're gonna talk about this more in details in the items section. Now let's see what's changed on the Master side, starting with the innate ability, which says at the start of your turn, if you're in ranged battle form, deal 2 damage to an enemy in sight. So previously it was a targetable enemy, which means both in sight and in range, but now we have just sight, which means no longer having a range restriction, and therefore we can deal damage to any enemy on the same tile or adjacent tile, which means we can basically deal this damage to any enemy in a clash encounter. And I think this change is awesome, especially if you manage to upgrade your class to Master pretty early in the game, where you maybe not necessarily have a lot of stamina yet, so your range is still quite limited, but with this innate ability, dealing damage to any enemy in sight is a quite serious power boost. Moving on, next we have the upgraded version of Accuracy for 1 tenacity in ranged battle form, enduring when selecting a target, increase your range by 1. So the effect stays exactly the same, but the difference is that now this ability is enduring, which means it's always active as long as you have 1 tenacity or more. And I think this is another awesome upgrade, because on the Novice side it was sometimes a little bit awkward to just spend tenacity to increase range, because I would say lethal arrow is probably the best way that you can spend tenacity on, so spending that on Accuracy was sometimes a little bit awkward, I would say, but now because it's enduring, it's essentially just another passive effect, so you always have +1 range essentially. Moving on, next we have Hawkeye, which stays exactly the same, no changes here, and I have no complaints with it. I think it's great already. Next we have Lethal Arrow, and it now costs 2 tenacity instead of 3, which is just amazing. This is the ability that I'm trying to use pretty much every turn, and kind of my main tenacity spender on this class, and with 2 tenacity it's definitely now much easier to spend it in pretty much every turn, or maybe every other turn, depending of course on your misses, but generally speaking the difference between 3 tenacity and 2 is very noticeable for sure. Next we have the upgraded version of Hunter's Discipline for 3 tenacity. Interrupt when a non-quest enemy is deployed, remove it and deploy a random enemy of the same level to the same hex. Gain 3 bonus health. So previously on the Novice side it was 3 heal, which honestly sometimes wasn't even needed, especially since you're using this mostly at the start of the encounter, which was sometimes a little bit waste, but now because we gain this 3 health as bonus health, this is definitely much more helpful. As I said, this ability is great particularly when you're playing true solo and when you're deploying some enemies that you know they're gonna be pretty troublesome, so you can remove them and now gain even as bonus health, which essentially increases your survivability, gaining just a little bit more protection, a little bit more kind of extra health to absorb some damage, which is just awesome. I think this is a very nice change. I wish it would cost 2 tenacity instead of 3, but hey, maybe I'm just asking too much. And finally we have the upgraded version of Venom Arrows, which now costs 4 tenacity capacity instead of 5, but honestly this didn't change that much personally for me. I would still rather use a little arrows, especially since now it costs only 2 tenacity, which means you can use it twice for the cost of 1 venom arrows. So yeah, just dealing more damage, more reliable damage, and especially more true damage is what I like about this class. And even though this change of reducing tenacity cost down to 4 is still pretty nice of course, but maybe not something that I would personally use much in solo in particular. Now let's pick a race for our archer, and the first option I would consider is Wood Elf. I think playing a Wood Elf archer is the most thematic way you can play, but of course even beyond the theme, starting with 5 health and 3 stamina is pretty nice. It's definitely quite a strong start, and of course the racial ability that you can apply stealth status die on demand can also help quite a lot, particularly because the archer class doesn't have any damage mitigation, so this stealth can give a little bit more protection, at least in that sense. Next we have Argonian, and I would say they are in the similar vein, kind of more defensive options because of their innate ability that once per battle you can just prevent all damage, which again is very helpful for a class like archer because it's generally pretty squishy, I would say. All those stats are also pretty great, 5 health, 3 stamina, all of those is really helpful, and in combination with this race ability I would say the Argonian archer would be even more kind of sustainable and more all-rounded when it comes to both offense and defense. Speaking more on the offense side, we have another option which is Orc. If you've seen my racial abilities tier list, you know that I rank Orc pretty high, and I think it's actually one of the strongest racial ability in the game because having extra turn can be very powerful, especially once you level up your cooldown to a pretty good value. You can essentially take an engage, defeat some potentially high threatening enemy, maybe even make another engage to defeat another enemy, then trigger your once per battle racial ability to recover all of those dice, and then make another engage or 2 to defeat even more enemies. So if you like doing those kind of crazy powerful turns, Orc is definitely the way to go. Personally, I'm not a big fan of gaining over fatigue on the archer class in particular, because I would say you want to be pretty mindful about your cooldown track if you want to cycle all of those damage dealing dice quite effectively, especially if you're playing on the expert difficulty and you cannot remove this over fatigue kind of freely at the end of the day phase during your adventure rest, and you must discard an item in order to activate this, and sometimes you don't want to discard an item, or sometimes you don't have the item in the first place, especially early in the game. So in that sense I would say be just a little bit cautious if you choose Orc to play on the expert difficulty, although of course on the normal and easy difficulties this is just the easy pick. And going even further on the offense, I would consider going with Nord. Now Nords probably aren't the best stats wise, just 4 health and 2 stamina, this might be a little bit more challenging in the early game, especially since the archer class doesn't have any way of mitigating damage or preventing damage in some capacity. However, this racial ability is what makes them so strong, particularly somewhat towards the second half of the game when you have enough items in your inventory so you can deal just absolutely crazy strong burst damage. And I would say that the bow skill line that we're definitely gonna go with this build is probably not as damage dealing as some other melee skill lines, for example like two-handed or even one-handed shield, so being able to deal more damage and quite a lot of extra burst damage is definitely helps. Now keep in mind that if you're gonna go for Node Archer, this is like a classic glass cannon archetype, which means you're 100% all in on the offense, but you will be very squishy. And kind of the general idea with this glass cannon archetype is just deal a bunch of damage and potentially defeat all enemies, or at least more threatening enemies, before they have a chance to deal some damage back to you. And as I always say, in this game you cannot go wrong and you can pair any class with any race, but personally I had quite a lot of fun playing as Node Archer as this glass cannon archetype, and this is what I'm gonna go for in this video as well. Alright, so we've got our race, we've got our class, it's time to build our character. First I'm gonna slot in health on the top left corner, for no apparent reason, just the way I like it to have it here. Now for stamina we have a question whether we want to slot this on a new row or across health, and in this case I think I'm gonna slot this just because I know that I want to level up my stamina quite a lot. So next we have Magicka, and I think we have a pretty interesting choice on whether do we even need any magic on this class, on this character, and it honestly depends. I would say if you're not planning to use any Magicka and you're eventually planning to even untrain it, then your best option would be probably slotting this across stamina, simply because you can then untrain your Magicka at any moment that you want, so there won't be any clash here. But in my case I actually do want to use some magic, and you'll see why in a moment when we get to that, but for now I'm just gonna slot this across health with 2 corresponding stat tokens, just like that. For combat we have another choice, whether do we want to slot this across stamina and potentially even untrain some of those combat dice, or do we want to slot this on a new row. And personally I would rather prefer having this on a new row, because we're actually gonna use all of those 3 combat dice, and that's frankly the reason why I love Nord in particular. And for the starting skill line, as you probably already guessed, we're gonna use the ranged battle phone, so it makes sense that we're gonna use bow as our starting skill line, of course with 2 corresponding level 1 dice called Snipe. and we already have our cooldown set to 2, that means our character is good to go. Now for your first advancement, you would probably want to train some skill die from your main skill line. That's what most people do, and that's what I personally do as well on some other classes, other characters. But with this particular starting combination of race and skill line, we have already quite a lot of damage. Even with just those dice, we can already deal 5 damage with 2 pierce, so 2 ignoring defense plus 1 extra damage once per combat from our race ability, so we have plenty of damage. The only problem is that we can't use all of those dice together, because we only have 2 stamina, and also our range is also limited to 2, which is just not enough for a ranger for sure. So as the very first character progression on this build, I like training stamina, and not just 1, but at least up to 4. That's what I always do before training even any other skill dice, even from the main skill line. And 4 stamina is obviously great not only to roll more dice in a single engage, so we could already roll 4 of these dice together, but even most importantly, having a range 4 is quite a big break point, because when you're dealing damage to an enemy that is 4 hexes away, that means that enemy with a normal movement of 2 cannot reach you in the same turn. And that is a huge difference between range 3 and range 4, so this is another reason why I always like to train stamina at least up to 4 very early on. It also helps to come closer to the master requirement of defeating the enemy 6 or more hexes away. It's not enough yet obviously, but maybe with the help of some bow in combination with accuracy, that is now definitely more doable. Now we can focus on our main damage dealing skill line, and the first die I would train is volley. It's not something we care about too deeply because we're gonna untrain this anyway, but I think choosing between 2 level dice of the bow skill line, I think this is the best option. It just provides a little bit more of consistent damage and just extra mobility, which might help quite a lot as well, especially early on. Now once we have volley, we can train a level 3 skill die, and here I'm gonna choose a rapid fire just because I quite like the synergy between snipe and this one. And now once we have a level 3 skill die, at this point I prefer to even untraining volley entirely, of course moving this die to the left slot and then training scatter shot right away of level 4. And of course you could potentially keep around volley for a little bit longer, but that way your scatter shot would cost just 1 extra experience more, and I would rather prefer to train this as quick as I can, because it essentially doubles the damage, doubles of the output of our engage. And of course you're definitely gonna need a little bit more cooldown, probably at least 3 at this point, ideally 4, but 3 is a decent start, and maybe just 1 extra health just to be slightly on the safer side, because 4 just might not be doable. Somewhere around that point, or probably even earlier, you should train another stamina, so you could roll more dice in a single engage and also guarantee become a master archer if you haven't already at this point. Now the question is whether to continue training the bow skill line for the 2 most expensive slots, or invest some experience in potentially another skill line. And well, what additional skill line can potentially provide some extra damage? And frankly, there aren't that many. You can potentially train acrobatics, because if you move through enemies you can deal some damage this way, or you can potentially even train acrobatics all the way up to level 4, up to defiance, to make your rolls more reliable. That's a decent option as well, but personally out of all options I much prefer having light armor over here. Keep in mind that this skill line does require Valen with expansion, so if you don't have access to this skill line, consider training acrobatics or maybe even speech, so we could roll and use your class abilities more often, especially lethal arrow. This is kinda another way of kinda getting more damage out of your class, but I think light armor is just the best option. And that is the whole reason why I prefer to keep magicka rather than untraining it. So what we even want from the light armor? Well, on level 1, nothing in particular really. I prefer to train spell warding just because it can provide just a little bit more defense, although we're still gonna untrain this later. Because once we have this one, we can train a level 2 skill die, which is evocation, which you can use to decrease the value of evocation itself to increase the value of another light armor die. And once we have this trained, we can untrain this spell warding, so this is why I said that we're not gonna care about too much about it. Of course we're gonna slot this one over here, which then allows us to train annulment and of course concentration, and this is the whole reason that why I like this skill line so much, on this character in particular. But actually let's take a step back and talk about annulment first, just why I like it so much. And well, this essentially kinda like a fear, which means if you target some nasty enemies like stalwart enemies or divert enemies or shatter enemies, you can completely shut down all of those nasty enemy skills with annulment. This is why it's so strong. And I also quite like that you can use it for preventing gaining a status die, which can be quite nasty, especially some blind or fear or frankly even bane. So there's just a lot of utility from this annulment, and I like it so much. But of course this is absolutely the king of the skill line for this build, concentration, which allows us to add potentially up to 6 enemy combat dice to our engage. So not only we have 6 combat dice from our race ability once per battle, but we can also add another 6 enemy combat dice with this concentration, which is just huge burst of damage. Though of course concentration is pretty tricky because it has only one side with number 3, and there are also 50% chance of landing a miss, so this is not the most reliable die I would say, but this is why we trained evocation, because as soon as you roll this, even with a number 1, that is still already enough in most cases, provided that you have this evocation, because you can reduce this die, let's say down from 2 to 0, so you can exhaust this die to increase this up to 2, which is just an absolutely crazy combo. And of course, just to be able to roll these dice together, I think it's best to train a third Magicka as well, because otherwise you would be a little bit awkward in rolling this 3 dice in 2 different engages. And I think now we can return back to this our main skill line and train some other skill dice in the remaining slots. And the first one, believe it or not, I would train another skill die of level 1, which is Snipe. I think it's just great to pierce through another enemy defense and also to buff up and boost up our damage from rapid fire. So this is a nice kind of synergy going on here. And for the final slot, I think this is debatable. You can either train another Snipe die, although in my opinion that might be a little bit overkill because there are very few enemies with 4 defense. So in the majority of cases, 3 is all you need. So I guess the real question is whether you want to train another rapid fire, which might be pretty decent, I guess, just more damage, which is good. Although personally I would prefer in this particular build training as a last die this Vine Dusk training. It provides just a little bit more sustainability, it helps to recover dice more quickly, making more engages when you need it, especially since we have some other dice that we're gonna roll from the light armor skill dice, so we will gonna have some nasty light fatigue in our cooldown track, and so this Vine Dusk training gonna slightly help to make this kind of cycle of dealing more damage more quickly, more reliably, more consistently. And of course you cannot go wrong with training some extra health. I think having up to 7 health definitely makes us just a little bit more tanky, and the more health we have, the more potential health we can recover with Hawkeye, so this is just another kind of little way of staying alive, especially in the late games. And of course definitely train at least 4 cooldown, I would say this is the bare minimum, although keep in mind that this is already 39 experience, which is quite a lot, so this is how your character might look like somewhat towards the late game, towards the end of the session too. But of course if you still happen to have even more experience, maybe you gain some bonus experience, always was pretty lucky with the delves, you can of course train even 6 stamina and 5th cooldown. This will help of course a lot as well. The personal, I would probably leave it like that, just to keep the experience kind of down to a more realistic level, and it's also gonna make our enemy pool in the demo section a little bit more challenging, because as you know, whenever the enemy pool ends on 9, this is the most challenging as you can get. So 39 is how I'm gonna leave this build like that. This is already a crazy amount of damage, especially with this concentration and our racial ability, and you're gonna see this in action soon. Now let's talk about some items that work well with this build, and the first one is Ash Longbow. I think out of all weapons and all bows, this one might be the best one. And it says that if your target is 3 or more hexes away, set 1 combat skill die rolled with this engage to 2 damage. And this works so well, particularly with our Nord Archer, because we're gonna roll a bunch of enemy combat dice, or combat dice in general, so there is a pretty high chance that at least some of them would be rolled to miss, and by changing the result to 2, you essentially increasing your damage by 2. But of course, even if you didn't roll any misses, even if your combat skill dice landed on a 1, you can still change this to 2, so effectively increasing the damage by 1. So overall, this is just a nice flat damage increase. You can increase the damage either by 1 or by 2, depending on the roll of your combat dice, but this works so well with this kind of general and glass cannon archetype that we're building. There are some other useful bows as well, some of them already mentioned. It's a Bow of the Deadland, Maple Bow, and Rat Skewer Bow. I think Bow of the Deadland and Maple Bow are particularly helpful in the early game, because they can help you to promote to the master side much quicker, especially Bow of the Deadlands. But that being said, this is probably not something I would keep in the very late game. Though of course remember that if you're playing Nord Archer, you definitely want to hoard as many weapons as you can, so even if you got these items early in the game, just still keep them in your inventory, in your pack. This will still come in handy. Rat Skewer Bow is something that we not actually need, and as a matter of fact you kind of go against the Ash Longbow. There is some anti-synergy, because with Ash Longbow you want your target to have 3 or more hexes away, while with the Rat Skewer Bow you can target adjacent enemies. But I find that it's still sometimes nice to have this item, just in case, or maybe in some delves in particular, where some kind of narrow corridors. Again, it's just more like a nice to have, definitely not as good as Ash Longbow. Another item that works great with Archer is Shoulder Mounted Parasol. Its accessory for 1 tenacity interrupt. When you would gain any amount of light fatigue, remove 1 light fatigue from your cooldown track instead. And this item works just absolutely beautifully with the rapid fire, when this die lands on the side that recovers dice, but replacing them with light fatigue. But of course, even without rapid fire, it's still pretty helpful. It allows you to do more engages and kind of clear off your cooldown a little bit, which is especially relevant if you're playing on expert difficulty, because after each engage you add in 2 extra light fatigue, and this item definitely helps to clear it up a little bit, making you recover your actually damage damage dealing dice more quickly and therefore can deal more damage overall on average. The next two items to work with this build is something that can help us to prevent some damage. It's Silver Dawn Jack and Warm Cult Sabatons. Both of them say that you can prevent 1 damage and recover dice, some thief dice and some magic type dice, and of course we don't care about any of those dice, we just want to prevent some damage. And because these items they have different traits, this is a chest and this is feet, it means they can stack, they can work together. So if you happen to have both of these items in your ready slot, after you engage by enemy you can prevent up to 2 damage in total with these two items, which can be just absolutely lifesaver against some occasional hits that you might take here and there. And lastly we have another item called Signet of the Worm. It's a ring that says discard this item before rolling during an engage. All damage dealt to your target this engage is also dealt to all other targetable enemies. So essentially this item alone can wipe the entire clash, especially since we have our Nord racial ability. We can deal a bunch of damage in a single engage, and all this damage would be dealt also to all targetable enemies. So this is obviously extremely powerful, and for that reason just want to give you a little cautious, kind of be mindful that this item is probably not something you would want to use when playing with other adventurers, because it can feel just so anticlimactic when you by yourself just clearing up the entire clash, and even in solo this might feel a little bit anticlimactic as well, but this is just more like a fun category I guess, and it again works so nice with this Nord Archer glass cannon archetype build. Alright, and finally let's see how this class and this build plays and feels in action. For this purpose I created this demo clash battle with the enemy pool of 39 because that is how much experience I have, and so we have level 20 Flame Atronach, level 10 Khajiit Cultist, level 5 Argonian Marauder, and 4 level 1s, Red Guard Bandit, Wood Elf Bandit, Orc Bandit, as always plenty of bandits, and Gar Beast. As always I'm having a complete fresh start, which means I don't have any tenacity, and I must say that sometimes on this character might be a little bit tricky to gain tenacity because we don't have any acrobatic skill dice, or in general we don't have just a lot of skill dice to roll, so sometimes getting tenacity on this class might be a little bit tricky I would say. And also all of my skill dice are available, which in this case isn't as good either, because remember that all skill dice from the light armor skill line they can persist in your active slots between battles, so quite often, or I would say normally, you would find yourself with those old skill dice already sitting in your active slots at the start of the battle, and because I have all of them available that means I'm gonna need to roll them again, which means that is another extra engage, that is extra light fatigue and so all this jazz. However, just as an exception, I do have some items in my inventory just so I could use my Nord racial ability. I won't actually use any items even though I have some bow here. You can just imagine that I have some random weapons somewhere in my inventory, so just so I could use my ability. I'm not gonna use any effects of those weapons, it's just for this purpose, because I thought it just would be nice to show you this ability in action as well. Alright, so it's beginning of combat round 1, it's adventurer's turn, and right at this very moment remember that our innate ability that at the start of turn, if you are in ranged battle form, which I'm currently are, I can deal 2 damage to any enemy in sight, which basically means any enemy on this clash tile. And well, let's see who can we choose as a target for this ability. Of course this ability won't do any damage to the level 20 enemy as well as level 10 enemy, because they both have more than 2 defense, which will prevent this attack entirely. We also have 3 enemies with 1 defense, Orc Bandit, Argonian Marauder and Red Guard Bandit, and we also have 2 enemies with no defense, it's this Gar and Wood Elf Bandit, and I would say in order to get the maximum value out of this ability it's best to select some of those 2 enemies, so the question is who exactly. Generally speaking I would prefer to target this Gar because it has 2 combat dice, so this is a little bit more threatening compared to Wood Elf Bandit, but because it has the enemy skill Colossal and I have 3 combat dice, that means this enemy is deployed with 6 health, so I guess I could have defeated this enemy just with my innate ability in 3 turns, but I have a feeling that this Khajiit Cultist will heal this enemy because of the ritual, so that might be just a little bit annoying. This Wood Elf Bandit on the other hand, because it has only 5 health, which is an odd number, that means if I deal 3 damage and this Khajiit Cultist will heal it for 1, that still will take me just 2 extra turns to defeat this enemy with my ability, so you know what, I think I'll probably deal 2 damage to this Wood Elf Bandit, bringing it down from 5 to 3 health. That would be my play. Alright, now it's actually my turn when I can start doing some actions, and well, let's see who is the most threatening enemy here. I think obviously level 20 is the highest priority simply because it has 5 range and 4 combat dice. Really scary enemy. But for the next priority I would say normally it would be level 10, but in this case this level 10 Khajiit Cultist, even if it moved 2 hexes closer to me, it still won't be able to reach me, so I would say this is not an immediate immediate threat. However, this level 5 enemy Argonian Marauder is certainly are. It rolls 3 enemy combat dice and divert enfeeble. This is one of the hard-hitting level 5 enemies, and because it's standing so close, this is definitely a lot of threat. I also have this quite annoying Red Guard Bandit. Even if it's just a single combat die, it still can roll 2 damage, and remember that we don't have any ways of preventing damage, so even that can be quite bad. And also it has steel, and this is just annoying for especially old Nord characters, because they generally hoarding a lot of weapons in their inventory, so you definitely want to get rid of all those steel enemies ideally early before they try to steal anything from you. Alright, so for my first engage, I'm definitely gonna target Flame Atronach, but because I'm gonna use my scatter shot, I can select another targetable enemy, and ideally that would be Argonian Marauder, just because this enemy is also a big threat, but because it has a divert enemy skill, which is very annoying, which means I won't be able to one-shot this enemy no matter what. So you know what, I think as my second enemy, as my second target, if I roll scatter shot, I'm gonna select a Red Guard Bandit. So first I'm taking scatter shot alongside probably all 3 snipe dice, because this enemy has 3 defense, and I'm also gonna use my racial ability to add all 6 enemy combat dice to this engage. Yeah, this is why I like Nords so much. But would this be enough? Well, let's see. If all snipe dice can pierce through the enemy defense, means I would need only 3 dice, so potentially there is already quite a lot of extra damage just to be safe. But you know what, if some of those snipe dice lands on the miss, that might be a little bit problematic. So even though that should be enough, statistically speaking, just to have a little bit more kind of bad luck protection, you know what, let me add another combat die as well. And remember that enemy combat dice, they don't count towards the limit of dice you can normally roll, so that's why I can roll 5 of my normal dice and also add that many dice of enemy combat dice to this engage. Alright, so this is what I'm rolling, targeting Flame Atronach and Red Guard Bandit as my second target if I roll scatter shot. Let's see what we get. And wow, look at this roll. We have scatter shot landed, which is good, but we have miss on our snipe die, so I'm glad that I added another combat die to this engage, because otherwise that might not be enough. But of course, let's see. So we have 2 damage from snipe dice and 2 ignoring defense, plus 2 damage, and that is, wow, that's it, another 2 and another 2. So that is pretty lucky, I guess, maybe to compensate for those misses. So I guess statistically speaking, they can balance each other out. So let's see how much damage we have. That is 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, 10, and 11 damage with 2 pierce, with 2 ignoring defense. That is surely totally enough to defeat this Flame Atronach, as well as this Red Guard Bandit. 2 enemies down, yay! Now I'm returning all of those enemy combat dice to the supply and placing my dice to the cooldown track, and I think I'm gonna place them in that order, just because I want to make sure that all of my bow dice recovered first. So this is how I'm slotting this in my cooldown track, like that, and I'm also gaining 1 tenacity because of the miss. Now I'm taking another engage and I'm adding 2 light fatigue, and that is so because I'm playing on the expert difficulty. I'm switching my battle form to Magicka to roll all of these dice from the light armor skill line. I don't need to declare a target, this is just basically my buffs, and let's see what we get. And let's see what we get. This is a pretty poor roll, I would say, because we have concentration only 1 out of 3, we have evocation on 2 out of 3, and annulment on 3 out of 5. So yeah, this is definitely not the best roll by any means, but hey, I guess it still will come in handy. Right, so this is how I'm placing this in my active slots, and now I'm gonna take another engage, adding 2 more light fatigue to my cooldown track and switching battle form back to range. But before doing that, I'm gonna reduce my evocation from 2 down to 1 to increase my annulment from 3 up to 4, like that. And I needed to do that so I could use my annulment in order to ignore enemies' skills for this engage. And just to explain a little bit what's going on here, this annulment says that you can reduce this die by 3 to ignore enemy skills for this engage, and I already had 3 if you just noticed, so why would I do that? Why would I reduce my evocation by 1 to increase annulment by 1 if I already had 3? And well, this die is a little bit tricky, because if I look at all of the sides, it has 5, it has 4, 3, 2, and that's it. It just misses. So it goes from 5 to 2, and there is no face with a number 1. That means if you have this 3 and you reduce this by 1, that would be 2. Then you reduce another 1, that would be 0, and then you would exhaust this die. So in other words, if you have this number 3 and you want to reduce this die by 3 in order to use this effect of ignoring enemy skills, you won't be able to do that. You can only do that if you have 4 or higher on this die. And this is just another reason why I like evocation so much in combination with this annulment, because if you roll annulment poorly, just like I did, you still have a chance, you still can adjust this die by reducing evocation, so this is just a slightly kind of bad luck mitigation, I would say. Alright, so back to the engage. Now I'm reducing this die by 3 in order to ignore these enemy skills, which brings this die from active slot to my cooldown track. It's now exhausted, but now I'm ignoring this enemy skill divert, which is exactly what I want. And for this engage I'm gonna roll rapid fire alongside Vine Dusk Training, and I probably don't even need to add any other dice because this enemy has 5 health and 1 defense, which means I need to deal 6 damage, and that is exactly how much damage rapid fire can deal when I have 3 snap dice in my cooldown track. So that is another reason why I like to have 3 snap dice trained rather than 2, because dealing 6 damage with rapid fire is quite a significant breakpoint, because quite a lot of level 1 or some level 5 enemies, they have up to 6 health in total, so this just helps a lot to kind of one-shot them in one go. So I don't need to add any other combat dice or enemy combat dice with my concentration, just a single rapid fire should do it alongside Vine Dusk Training. So let's see what we get. And we've got both dice landed, not on the best side unfortunately. I would rather prefer this rapid fire to also recover my snap dice, so I could maybe take another engage, but you know what, that's still fine. My cooldown track is probably full anyway, so first I'm resolving this Vine Dusk Training, placing this in my active slot, and then I'm dealing 6 damage with a rapid fire to Argonian Marauder, which would defeat this enemy in one go. Yay, another enemy down. And I think as the final action of my turn, I just make one step back so none of this enemy could reach me. And yeah, this is one of the reasons why I always say that playing a ranged character is definitely an advantage compared to playing a melee character, because you can just safely stand in here on the entrance tile and potentially taking no damage whatsoever. So alright, enemy's activation turn, starting with the level 10 Khajiit cultists. They move into hexes closer to me, and then using their ritual healing everyone for 1 health. So this Wood Elf Bandit takes 1 health back. Speaking of Wood Elf Bandit, it also moves 2 hexes closer to me, as well as this Gar Beast moving 2 hexes closer to me as well, and this Orc Bandit 1-2 hexes closer towards me, and that would be the end of enemy's turn. Now it's the beginning of combat round 2, and remember that at this very moment I can trigger my start of turn effects, and so I think I'm gonna deal 2 damage again to this Wood Elf Bandit using my innate ability, taking off 2 health, and also because I have Vine Dusk Training in my active slot, if I want to use this effect, now would be the right time, because it also happens at the start of turn. And remember that with this die I can recover 2 other dice from my bow skill line, or 3 if all of them are snipe. And I think I'm gonna recover my rapid fire alongside scatter shot, so I'll be able to use them again, and then I'm exhausting this die, sliding all remaining die like that, and only now triggering my recovery step, so recovering all 4 dice as normal, so all of my snipe dice as well as the combat dice are recovered, and I'm ready to deal some damage again. Now as my first engage, I'm definitely gonna try to defeat this Khajiit cultist, because it's now already coming closer, so that is now a pretty threatening enemy, and I guess I can use my scatter shot to select a second target, and the question is, who should I select as my second target if this scatter shot lands? And I think I will select Orc Bandit, even though it doesn't have any immediate threat, it's still far away, but as my second engage then I'm gonna plan to get rid of this Gar enemy using my rapid fire, because it has exactly 6 damage, so that hopefully should work. But now looking at my cooldown track, I'm not sure if I'll be able to feed all of those dice, because it looks like I already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dice, which means I can only feed 7 more. So if the idea is to roll my snipe dice first alongside scatter shot, that would be 4, plus then I would take another engage, adding 2 more light fatigue, that would be 6, and then rolling my singles rapid fire would be 7, so that would fit perfectly. But the only problem is that I have no slot to exhaust my light armor dice. Or maybe as another option I could use my scatter shot and then select this Gar enemy, and this way I probably won't even need to use another engage this turn. Alright, anyway, let's start rolling, and I think I'm gonna select all 3 of my snipe dice alongside scatter shot, and I'm also reducing my evocation to 0 to increase this concentration by 1, so that is now 2, and now I'm reducing this evocation by 2 as well, so adding 4 enemy combat die to my engage. So these are the dice that I'm rolling, targeting Khajiit cultist. That definitely should be enough to finish it off. Well, let's see how it goes. And we've got scatter shot landed again, but we also have miss on the snipe die again. Do I even have enough damage now to defeat this enemy? Well, let's see, we have 2 and that is 4 more, so that is 6 damage with 2 ignorant defense. That is exactly how much damage we need to defeat this enemy. Wow, that was pretty close. Alright, so Gadget Cultist is defeated, and I'm also dealing the same 6 damage to another enemy in range, and I'm selecting this Garbeast because it also happened to have 6 health, so that is pretty nice as well. So I'm returning this enemy combat dice to the supply and moving all of those dice to my cooldown track, and also gain 1 tenacity, so I have 2 tenacity now, which is enough now to use my lethal arrow, and this is what I'm probably gonna do, targeting this Wood Elf Bandit, because otherwise it looks like I have no way to go, and I definitely don't want to take this damage. So I'm spending 2 tenacity, and I'm gonna add 2 roll, 2 enemy combat dice to my roll, and this damage would be true damage targeting Wood Elf Bandit. Let's see. And we've got 2 damage, which is all we needed to defeat this enemy, so Wood Elf Bandit is down as well. Then I'm returning this to the supply, and that's it. I guess I could have potentially made another engage, but that would burn a lot of my dice, and I don't want to get over fatigue and all this jazz, so I'm just finishing off my turn like that, leaving my character like that, and now is the enemy's activation turn, then just moving 2 hexes closer, and that would be it. Alright, now it's beginning of combat round 3. As always, at this very moment my innate ability is triggering, so I'm dealing 1 damage to this enemy, because it has 1 defense. Now I'm recovering 4 dice, moving all the slight fatigue to the supply. And so because I have this 3 snipe die sitting in my cooldown track, this single rapid fire we should do it, so I'm rolling a single die against a single enemy. That will probably finish off the fight. Let's see. And it sure did. We're dealing 6 damage, so the last enemy is down, and that's pretty much it. I'm placing this in my cooldown track, and that is the end of the battle. Defeated all enemies, taking no damage, thanks to my huge burst because of this Nord racial ability, as well as some extra dice from concentration. They definitely will come in handy in many situations, and also the innate ability and the lethal arrow. Just quite a lot of damage in this build, and that's why I like it so much, even though, as I said, it's a very squishy, very fragile. It's 100% a glass cannon archetype type of build. And that's a wrap for today's video. This class, guys, take quite a bit of time and effort to put together, so if you found this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe for more board gaming content. And if you would like to support the channel directly, you can also do this over on Patreon, and it really means a lot to me. And well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.